Well, hello, Front Range front end fans. So glad you're all here. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Just want to recognize up front that this is a bit of a week, especially for US based viewers. A lot going on, and I'm glad you've made time for this. Everybody's got different ways of coping with different levels and kinds of stress. And for those of you who are coping by learning new things, cool, that's great. For those of you who will watch this later because there's just too much and you need to rest, I hope that when you do get around to watching this, you are rested, you feel mentally and physically refreshed, and things are going better. We're going to pick up on a thread, as it were, a note started a few months ago. Zach Brooks did a talk on 123 Jamstack or 321 Jamstack. Should have looked that up. But it was a great talk. And in it, he briefly introduced a static site generator called Eleventy. And Eleventy is a tool I've loved using. I've put it into play in a dozen or more, probably more sites, and have just been really enjoying it. So what I wanted to do tonight is start with the basics. How do you get Eleventy up and running? What does it even do? And move from there into some kind of fancier, more enterprise level features and techniques, what you can do with it. So without further ado, we're going to jump into Eleventy. If you're brand new to this, we've got something for you. And if you used it a couple times but are looking to level up your skills, hopefully we're going to have some techniques and some tricks here that are going to help you a lot with that as well. So what is Eleventy? Before we get into the slides proper, I want to kind of answer that question. It is a static site generator. It takes content, data from a source, and it turns it into a fully compiled static file HTML site. Static sites, that doesn't mean you can't have JavaScript at all. It doesn't mean you can't have cool features. It doesn't mean nothing happens except you can read a page and go home. And we're going to talk about some of those cool features. For those of you who have been around for a while and have used Jekyll a few times, Eleventy is a lot like Jekyll in some of the patterns you'll notice. It is a node-based tool, however, so any extensions, any customizations, any adjustments you want to make to it are written in JavaScript, which for a lot of us who are in this front-end group, that's a much more natural and handy language to be working with than Ruby/YAML. Eleventy is also considerably more configurable than Jekyll. A lot of really great features we're going to get into, and a lot of really open-ended and powerful customizations available to us. And I say this not to say Jekyll's bad. Jekyll's not bad. Jekyll's great. It does a ton of things really well. But what I love about Eleventy is, especially for JavaScript primary developers, it's handy. It's a node module. It's ready to go. All your customizations are JS, and it's a much easier, in my book, tool to reach for. So without further ado, let's talk about how to install Eleventy. Oh, and I should say this as we go. If you have questions, I'm looking down at my other screen. If you have questions along the way, as they come up right away, go ahead and put them in the chat. I will generally pause at the end of each major section and answer those, but because there's about a minute delay on the video, if you've already typed it in the chat, that makes it so much more easy for me to answer it on time when I reach the end of a section, and saves us a little time of awkwardly staring at me for about 65, 75 seconds while I wait for questions to come in. So here we go. How do you install Eleventy? Well, it is a node module, as I mentioned earlier. So if you're familiar with JavaScript related projects, a Vue app, a React app, Angular, these kinds of things, where you npm install things, that's what we've got here. Before I get to the recommended method from me, I'm going to cover a couple things that show up really frequently in tutorials and explain how they work, but also give you more of an enterprise team, a better professional perspective on them. So the lazy, fast way to get Eleventy running is to use npx. That's node package execute. And essentially what it does is it downloads a copy of the node module and runs it, but it just kind of temp downloads it. It doesn't really like install it. And with this, anytime you run npx Eleventy, node installs Eleventy temporarily and runs it as a build tool. Note, it is important to have the @11ty namespace on the front. If not, plain old Eleventy with no namespace is somebody else's package, and all it will do is send you a console message saying you got the wrong Eleventy. I'm not going to generate anything for you. So you could use npx. This shows up in some of the tutorials. It's handy, it's quick, it's fast. If you're not running a package JSON kind of a situation, it does the job. The danger, though, is it's not version controlled at all. Anytime you run that, you get the latest release. So there's no semver attached. There's no way to prevent a breaking change in Eleventy, like a whole version bump. There's no way to hold back on that and keep using the version you had been using. The latest version, no matter what it is always going to come down with this. So it gets the job done, but there are better ways to do it. Another common suggestion is installing it globally. Here, npm install-g for global, the package. And my perspective on this kind of depends on your team's opinions about global modules in general. Again, it's still separated from any kind of version control. Your global module has nothing to do with anything that's like package JSON or anything tracked and shared for a team to rely on. So for that reason, I don't recommend the global installation. Also, if you're managing multiple node versions or updates, upgrades, and you're using a tool like NVM, Node Version Manager, whenever Node Version Manager changes node versions, it leaves all the global packages, the global modules behind. It does not import them to the new version, so you lose them all. So not a great option. What is a great option? What is an enterprise safe option? Here's what I recommend. Make sure you've got a package JSON file. npm init will create that for you. It'll ask you a bunch of questions about the information you want to go in that file, and it'll pre-build a really nice file for you. Once you've got package.json, then you do npm install save Eleventy/Eleventy. And one more upgrade, you can add a couple scripts to package.json's scripts object. And I like to alias build to Eleventy. That'll build the site. One action, take all the input, create all the output. And then start, npm run start, I like to have Eleventy-serve, which is Eleventy's built-in live server. It starts up a local host URL for you. It does live reloading anytime content or templates are changed. It's a really fancy and well-featured browser sync controlled live server. So this is the safest method, and this is what I recommend. Your version of Eleventy, the actual compiler for your entire site, is tracked in version control. It is semver controlled by npm installing according to package.json. And if you're sharing with a team and you're all installing and running it on your own machines, this is the best safe way to make sure everybody's working with the same tools. So that's installation. What if you need to configure it? Every Eleventy site, every Eleventy project folder you're working from can have a .eleventy.js file. This is the config file for Eleventy running in that directory. It is entirely optional. Eleventy comes with a really nice set of presets, good defaults, and if your plan matches the defaults, you don't have to change anything. You can just go run with it. Config should export, in this case, a function. Eleventy provides its own Eleventy config object, and then you return an object from the function that returns some details. One key is the directories, dir here. You can change template formats and a few other features. And then the Eleventy config object that's passed into this function also has a whole bunch of methods that we can use to customize how the site is built and how our templating and other features work. We're going to cover a lot of those Eleventy config methods, those functions, as we go. But for now, I'll just say there's a bunch of them, and we're going to check them out as we get to them. But again, you don't even need .eleventy.js if all of its defaults work great for you. We're going to jump into, in just a moment, setting up our content, but I am going to pause. I don't see any questions yet in the thread, but I'll give that last minute worth of things I said some time to show up with a question or two. I did say Eleventy has a great set of defaults, and we're actually going to cover some of the most common ones that affect the work we do in just a minute, but I wanted us to get through how to have content in Eleventy before we start looking at the defaults for how it runs. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of abstract information about how it runs and not really a sense of how to actually get into it, and tangibly change things, make stuff compile. So I think we're good. We're going to set up content. If you're used to Jekyll, which I've already pointed out as a great comparison, you may be used to Markdown files. And Markdown files start with these triple dash separated blocks of front matter. And the syntax for front matter is essentially a YAML object. YAML is a Ruby-like syntax, and that's the data structure. And here we have several keys. Title is the page title. Author, name of whoever the author is. Permalink is the URL you want this page to be generated at. Layout is whatever template file Eleventy should use to generate the page. Date is the date of publication. And then tags is an array of items. Here we just have one item in the array called news. And then everything after the front matter is Markdown and will be compiled to HTML by the Markdown engine. Very familiar, again, if you've used Jekyll, Metalsmith, and Hugo, and a number of other static site generators use very similar patterns. Even Gatsby runs off of the same Markdown with front matter syntax. So if you've been in static site generation for a project or two already, this slide is likely not a surprise to you. This feels like familiar territory, and that's good. None of these are required, except maybe title is really helpful to have all the time. You always want your pages to have a title. But any of these are optional, and we'll talk about Permalink in a second and what Eleventy defaults to there. But a whole bunch of files with Markdown in them is great. We kind of got to ask ourselves a question, though. How do I get a collection of them? How can I associate an array of pages when I need an array of pages in my templates? For example, maybe I need to collect navigation items, and only 4 pages on my site are going in the top level nav, and not all the blog posts. So how do we handle that kind of thing? Great question. Eleventy has a great feature called collections. And I mentioned the Eleventy config object that is passed by Eleventy by default into the function we return from eleventy.js back in module exports equals and then the function. Eleventy config is that default object, and it has a method called add collection. The first thing we provide is a name, nav. That will be the key name for which collection we use in our templates. And then the second argument here is a function. Again, we're using the fat arrow function syntax. And that function is given a default collection object. This comes from Eleventy. They provide that default for you. And we use the collection object thusly. Here we do collection.getAll, and that means it goes through every Markdown or HTML or other source file, not just templates and layouts, but the actual source files, and it makes them all a giant array of page objects. Then we can filter, and inside of the filter item function, we would say one pattern is on my blog, I use the menu order property in my front matter for all the pages that are going to go in my top level nav. So we would do, does item.data have menu order key? And then we would sort, is a.data.menu order higher or lower than b.data.menu.order? And that's how we would sort it. And now we have a navigation collection that is just one array of page objects, and we can use it wherever we need to in our templates. This is better than methods like having a folder name to collect data, because a file can only be in one folder. Here you can collect a file in as many collections as you can write cases for it to match. So the same files, the same content chunks can be in multiple collections. A very handy way to do this all programmatically and not relying on things like file system location to get collected posts or pages. Now let's pretend we're switching over to one of our layout template files for the top level nav, for example. Now we can loop through every link in collections.nav. We created a named collection here, nav, and it shows up as a global variable for any template to consume. Every template has access to collections dot whatever. So here collections.nav is an array of pages that should go in the navigation, and for each one, we create a list item with a link that has href to that item's URL and the item's title in it. And that's how we can build navigation. But let's level this up a little bit. In a lot of use cases, for example, you might be digging into work with a really demanding client in a good way, and they need to be able to edit content in a nice CMS kind of a place. And so the idea you have is maybe you set up like headless WordPress or Drupal, or get them installed on a CMS as a service like Contentful or Prismic or Sanity, one of these nice tools that gives them a CMS and provides you an API for collecting data from. How do you get an array of posts or an array of pages from a headless CMS and get those into your site-generated content. Here's how. Eleventy has a default directory pattern it looks for. If you have a folder called _data in your input folder, then you can have JS and JSON files in there into global data objects or variables available again for any template, much like a collection. What we're doing here in the posts.javascript file is we're exporting a function. The function is going to return a promise that contains an API request. You can use Fetch or Axios or whatever your favorite library is here. And a great thing about this I want to call out is all this JavaScript I'm writing here, and I'm showing you in this page, is, well, heavily truncated, but still, this is all happening on your machine. This is all running on your local node installation. None of this is going to a user's browser as part of a JavaScript bundle, meaning, take this with a grain of salt, this isn't hurting your performance at all. This isn't going to a giant bundle. It's going to slow down a user's download speed, and cross-browser issues aren't a thing. As long as you and your team are all using a version of Node that respects the code in these JS files that are related to templates and data in Eleventy, this code is never going to a browser. It's just running on your machine or a cloud machine for the sake of building the site. So browser support for my client doesn't support promises. That doesn't matter. This isn't client code. It's never going to a client. This is just your code running in Node for building the site. So pretty handy stuff. Yeah, you could use async and await on these functions as well. Get the data from the API, validate it, and then return an array of data. And because the file is named posts.js, any template can now access the global posts variable. That's how Eleventy makes data globally available. And here again, similar pattern to what we saw a second ago. I may be creating an archive page where it's going to list all of the posts and put their title inside of a link. But we're not done there because we don't want a whole bunch of posts just so we can make like an index archive type list. We actually want to generate a piece of content, an actual index HTML file in the right directory for every single one of these posts that we've queried from an API. So how do we do that? We can turn an array of data into a series of pages using Eleventy's pagination function. And this is actually part of the documented way Eleventy provides for turning data from an API into a series of pages. So this file might be simply called posts.md, just one markdown file that's going to handle generating, given Eleventy the instructions it needs to generate every single individual post file at the right URL. And the pagination key here takes in some data. Its data is the global posts data. You could change the size to anything you want in another use case, like if you're building paginated like archive pages for all of your posts and you want 10 posts per page. In that template, you would use size 10 perhaps, you know? But here, by setting the size to 1, we now generate an index HTML file for every individual post in that array of posts we queried. And we use the alias p so that we can easily get a hold of the current post. And that lets the link key here into the post's permalink value. And this is assuming that your API returned an object for each post and that object had a permalink key. If the object had a different key for the permalink, like URL or file path or something, then you would use that. But here we're telling the markdown permalink to be whatever the permalink or URL value is attached to that post object. And that lets us loop through the entire array of posts, but each loop only has one post in it, just one. So each loop generates a page, which is the post itself. So that's how to get content from an API, headless CMS kind of situation, and turn that all into a series of individual pages, generating all the content we need in one shot. So now that we know the two main ways to get content into Eleventy, markdown files, which can be grouped by collections, and data requests, which live in the data folder and are available as global variables for any template. Let's look at the defaults to Eleventy and see the areas where we might want to consider changing them. First off, default directories. You may remember a moment ago when I showed you the sample eleventy.js file, it returned an object and the key in the object was dir, a directory. Well, that can have 5 key value pairs. Input folder, the default is current folder, just dot. That's where it is on the file system. The output folder by default is underscore site. Then there are 3 folders for certain kinds of content. Input is just like any kind of content, but the things that are in the includes file are template related. Eleventy will, by default, not treat them as a source file for an individual page or post. It will just treat them as layouts, which is good. You can also layer on top of that a specific layouts folder. Eleventy's default is whatever value is directory.includes. So if you need to override that for specific layout files, like you've got a folder structure where you separate your main layouts from like individual liquid or nunjuck components, that kind of idea. You could do that. For most use cases, includes is great, and the layouts directory isn't usually that necessary. And then the default folder for data is underscore data. Quick note, includes, layouts, and data are all folders that Eleventy looks for inside of input. So if you change input to, say, SRC, following kind of a normal JS app convention, all your source files live in an SRC folder. Eleventy is going to look for includes, layouts, and data inside of source, SRC folder. It's not going to put the output inside of SRC. The output's still going to be in site. You can override that. You can use dist or public or www or whatever folder name you intend to use for the deploy. Docs, if you're in certain GitHub pages setups for your end content goals. These are default directories. How does Eleventy handle permalinks by default? I mentioned that I would come back to this a few slides ago. The front matter permalink object, a key, is the most explicit and safe way to declare a permalink, or what URL is Eleventy going to put this index.html file at. And worth mentioning, permalinks don't have to end in index.html. They can just end in a plain folder path, and it will put index.html there, but a permalink can write any kind of file. If you wanted to write home.html, or we'll get into later, even other kinds of file types that aren't HTML, we can do that with permalink. It's got some cool features, and there's some cool use cases that involve that. But what if a post or page, an object source doesn't have a permalink key in its front matter already? Then the fallback is Eleventy takes its file name, including the path, takes off the extension, and that becomes the path for index.html. That's the default. So contact.markdown would become contact/index.html. If you had a folder called tags, including a file called css.markdown, then it would go to tags css/index.html. Defaults for templating, worth covering. Liquid is the default. It's also my personal favorite. Your favorite can be different, and that's awesome. But like all these alternatives here, EJS to Mustache to Pug to Nunjucks, even JS files with template literals and interpolated data, all that's great. Eleventy supports all of that right out of the box. All you have to do is name your files correctly, and it does it. If it finds home.hbs in the templates includes directory, it'll use that as a template for any page that has layout set to home. If you had page.liquid, that would work. You just have to have the right syntax and the right file name, and you're going to be okay. One of Jekyll's limitations was it just does liquid. That's all, just liquid. And here Eleventy provides you a ton of freedom. A lot of folks I know really enjoy Nunjucks, and I've used that a few times. One feature that it has that Liquid doesn't, for example, is being able to run JavaScript functions on data when you're putting it into your template files. Liquid doesn't allow that. Nunjucks does, and that's a really cool feature for some devs. So whatever you and your team are down with, basically any standard HTML templating language is supported out of the box by Eleventy. Just name your files in the template folder the right way. And that, I'm going to pause again for about a minute and let y'all add any questions you currently have. We've got a great segue from templating defaults into how do we make templates? So we've covered how to install Eleventy, and recommend the safe way that uses package JSON to keep your semver and version control correct. Also, we've covered how to set up content. Markdown files are great. Data API requests are great. Eleventy can run the request at build time, and you save the request on a user at client side time. And then we've looked at some defaults and seen how Eleventy is set up from the get-go, and if all those defaults are perfect for you, no need to have a config file. But now that we've got content and we kind of know what the defaults are, how do we write templates? How do we write layout files that wrap our content and turn it into the real live markup that we want on every single page? Great question. Let's dig in. So the first thing is we use a layout. A layout is the first template that Eleventy reaches up to for a given piece of content. In, let's say, index.markdown is our sample code block file here. If it specifies layout home, then Eleventy is going to look for home.liquid in the includes directory. If you set a different directory, it'll go there. If you've got a layouts directory, it'll go there first. It'll look for home.liquid and home.nunjucks and home.handlebars and find whichever one it comes across first. You don't want to have multiple templates with the same file name and a different extension. So you don't want to have home.nunjucks and home.handlebars. Just, it's asking for confusion. Eleventy has a process and order in which it loops through those, and that's fine. But just don't make the code base more confusing than it needs to be. Just have one file, and in general, stick with one templating language for the most part for your whole site. That'll make it easier to share with other developers. So here is how you specify a layout. You can also chain templates, which is wrapping one layout in another layout, which is kind of cool. It reduces repetition. A great use case is you've got three kind of main templates: a generic page, a post, which has some extra blog-related sidebar-y stuff, and a custom home page template. So you've got home.liquid, page.liquid, and post.liquid. But you've got a lot of boilerplate that's going to wrap all three of those templates in the same way, right? You don't want to have to copy your HTML opening tag and your whole head information block and your opening body tag and your global site header and footer and repeat all that code in three different files: page liquid, post liquid, and home liquid. So here's what you can do. You can chain the templates so that the really repetitive stuff is one level up. Index Markdown says its layout is home. Great. Eleventy is going to wrap the content of the index markdown file, compiled HTML, in home.liquid. The liquid file can start with another front matter block, and if home.liquid says my layout is global, then awesome. Now everything that's index markdown's contents turned to HTML, wrapped up in home.liquid the way it should be, that's now inserted into global.liquid, where the content variable goes in that template file. So that's a great way to have all of your templates a little less repetitive, a little drier, and things work with less copy pasting. Because if you make significant changes, for example, to the way you're handling like open graph tags in your head, you don't want to copy and paste those changes to multiple files. So having global wrapping all of your other templates is a great way to reduce the repetition. Should you need to alias a specific layout to a specific file, maybe you're migrating content from a different system and the way layout properties, the layout key got written in all the front matter doesn't match your actual file structure, you're welcome to add a layout alias with the Eleventy config object in the Eleventy.js file. And here now the word home, wherever you see layout home, Eleventy is going to match that key, the word home, with views/hometemplate.nunjucks. Pretty cool. Not a ton of use cases for this. I think I did it once or twice and then realized immediately I didn't need to, but your call. So chaining templates, what I mentioned a minute ago, is kind of like an inside-out pattern. Start with the smallest thing, the content of the markdown file, then wrap it in a template, then wrap that in another template. But what if you need to go outside in? What if several templates need to call the same repeated block of markup or pattern in a component kind of a way? Well, as JavaScript developers, we're partial to components. Yes. So here's what you can do. You can include a partial liquid file. It's a complete liquid file. It's called a partial because it's part of a page, part of the whole. And that functions like a component. So if you made site header all its own /liquid, then you could just use include header in any parent component or template that needs to have the header generated in it. And you can use this instead of chaining to do all the repetitive stuff if you wanted to. There's another component syntax available for Eleventy work, and that is what's called a custom shortcode. Once again, we're using a custom function or a function based on the Eleventy config object that we have available in our Eleventy.js file. We're naming our shortcode link, and then we've got a function that expects a title and a URL. And then we're returning, here's a JS template literal with the URL and the href and the link, a class of link, and then inside of where the markup goes, we've got the title printed. I've got a shortcode almost just like this on this particular slide deck, which is being generated with Eleventy. Anytime you see that little yellow and green outbound link icon, that's more information from these slides, which are real HTML. You can read them again at your leisure, to documentation or really good illustrative blog posts, or even code files in some of my repos, where you can find these patterns and techniques in use. So a shortcode is a really good kind of advanced enterprisey pattern for Eleventy that you don't get in most default tutorials, but a really helpful way to provide a custom element, almost as it were, a component, and you would use it like this. You can even use these shortcodes in your Markdown because it's going through the templating engine. So liquid syntax, I'm calling the link shortcode, and I'm passing in the title cool hyperlink, and then that's my blog. You're welcome to read cool stuff there. Maybe if more people read it, I would publish more often. Probably I ought to publish more often and hope that more people read it. I think that's better. But anyway, this is a way you can use the link in a Markdown file even. You can also put the link shortcode in any template file, like home.liquid, if you needed to use that same syntax, like in the footer, something like that. But shortcodes are another way to componentize blocks of markup for your templating engines. That's all I wanted to say about templating. Any questions on that? I don't see anything coming through in chat yet. So I'm going to pause, refresh my H2O inside of me, and give you all a second if you've got a question or two to type. Alrighty. Seeing nothing yet, I will pause if something comes in the next 30 seconds, but other than that, I'll shift toward the asset pipeline, which is kind of a misnomer because the question is, how do I handle assets? How do I get my styles in? How do I get my limited client-side JavaScript into the site? How do I get icons or fonts or images prepped and ready to go for the site? And a lot of projects use asset pipeline to describe the one right way to handle assets. Their primary way to do it, it's just the thing. However, with Eleventy, there is no asset pipeline per se. You can basically manage your assets however you want to. And in that, it's either really powerful or perhaps for some a little confusing or frustrating. So I want to simplify it for you and then double down on the one I'm really keenest on. So here are the options you have for managing assets. Some folks like to run gulp or like a little Webpack situation or parcel or something of that nature right alongside of Eleventy. And that handles all of your JavaScript and your Sass or CSS and post CSS or however you're doing styles and mashes it all together. Great, optimizes your images, subsets your fonts, all sorts of cool stuff, right? I'm not super keen on having two separate task runners running in parallel. You can set it up in such a way that it doesn't interrupt each other and things play nice together and it's all good, and that's fine. I just don't like doing that. I migrated a Jekyll site that had gulp wrapped around it for some extra asset handling and wasn't super happy with the way things turned out. And when I converted to Eleventy, I kept that for a while. And then as soon as I found ways to handle all of this stuff in Eleventy native kind of a way, I was way happier doing it that way. So here's the recommended option from me. Other devs have different opinions. That's great. We can all do things differently. As long as each team agrees on what it's doing internally, that's awesome. Make good decisions for your use case, but based on my experience, here's my favorite way to handle assets. And that is a kind of template file we haven't looked at yet. We've covered things like Markdown and HTML, and you can even use like a liquid file as a template, etc. But you can also use a file that ends with .eleventy.js, and that JavaScript template file can do just about anything. And if you'll recall from our permalink slide 15, 20 minutes ago, the permalink doesn't have to end in index.html or generate an HTML file. It can generate any file. So here are some cool things we can do. You write a .eleventy.js template file. Module.exports will be a class, and that class has two functions. The data function returns an object of front matter data. It's just like the stuff you had in YAML front matter in a markdown file, but here it's a JavaScript object being returned. So a little cleaner, you can have functions in that object. One key can rely on a function that takes the data object itself and kind of recursively uses it. So you can generate permalinks based on file names and other data kind of things. It's really cool stuff. But that's an optional one. You don't have to have front matter, so data is optional. But the render function inside this class we're exporting is necessary, and the render function returns the contents of the file. You got a few options here. The contents of the file could be a string. That's great, that's easy, you know what's going on. It could be a promise that returns a string. It could be a buffer. Eleventy is happy with all these formats. It will write the file when the buffer resolves, when the promise is done, when the string is prepared. It asyncs things correctly, and waiting on files and lengthy processes and not a problem. If you're doing things that are too long as an operation, node-wise, you're going to have a little bit longer compile time, but Eleventy handles that. It doesn't worry about async files. It handles them. It's pretty cool. So let's look at a couple examples, and I'm not going to put like an entire Eleventy.js template file on the screen for you. I am, however, going to link in each of the bullet points on the next slide here to actual files in repos that you can check out for how you can take a CSS kind of source file and using post CSS to like do partials and imports and processing, run it all through post CSS and spit out one CSS file at the end of the process. You could get your main or styles.scss file and run Sass compiler in this file, which just runs on Node on your machine or the machine that's building the site for deploy, and you can run Sass as well. It will work. You can build your styles that way, and because the styles are being generated by an Eleventy.js template file, Eleventy is the only thing doing task management. It's the only thing running tasks that result in a live reload or an updated file. Pretty good stuff. You could grab an index.js or similar entry point JavaScript file, run it through Rollup and Webpack for transpilation and tree shaking, minification, all that great stuff, and return a single JavaScript file for your site that's been minified and uglified and all those cool fides. And because, again, it's an Eleventy.js template file, you don't need a separate task runner, and any kind of file watching and live reloading is just handled by Eleventy's live server. Of course, if you are pulling in other Sass files or other JavaScript files that also need to be watched to trigger that recompile, re-render, then by all means, here's a syntax for that. Eleventy config, again, has so many awesome methods. You can add a watch target, and it takes a globbing pattern. And here we're telling it any JavaScript files in my assets.js falls in my source/assets/scss folder. Watch those, and whenever they get changed, rebuild the site. Sometimes the asset story you're trying to tell is, I just need to copy these from one place to the other. I don't have to modify them at all. I just need to copy them right through. Once again, Eleventy config has your back with a function called add pass-through copy. You can just give it a single directory name and it'll copy that directory into the output folder, or you can use the object syntax, as you see in the second block of code here, where you specify an input with the key and then the output with the value for each part of the object. A more complicated situation deserves a slide of its own, I think, is how do we handle images? Because we want to optimize those, right? We don't want to send everybody real big, clunky, chunky images. You could use option one, add pass-through copy. We just saw that on the last slide, and then configure a build plugin wherever your site is being deployed, if that's an option. If you're using something like Netlify or GitHub Pages with a GitHub action to deploy the site, to build it and to serve it, then you can set up a GitHub action or a Netlify build plugin to optimize your images every time you commit to the site and a new deploy is created. That works. It's a little more complicated. And I also, I get nervous and don't really care for optimizers that run in a separate situation from my local server. Sorry, my slides are going a little bit goofy there. I don't like to have those running in a separate way from what I'm seeing in local dev. I want to try and make everything as even and identical as I can. What you can do is set up an images.eleventy.js template file. Our good friend, the Eleventy.js template file, is back again. And it can run image min or a similar node-based minifier with plugins like JPEG Tran or PNG Quant or others, SVGO, and you can get an array of images using node fs and reading a directory full of images. And with that array, loop through it. And again, pagination size equals 1, just like we took a data object, a data array we got from a headless CMS back like 35 minutes ago, right? We can take that array of image file names, feed them all through ImageMin, and create one file per output. And just like that, Eleventy itself can minify all of our images. I haven't tried this yet, but I'm 99% certain that if you've got a completely node-based font subsetting and optimization tool, you can run fonts.eleventy.js to get all your fonts out of a source folder, subset them according to your requirements, and serve lighter self-hosted fonts to your users. Essentially, anything you can process with Node can go through an Eleventy.js template file and be optimized or manipulated. I want to point out another Eleventy syntax feature that I'm not going to cover in depth today because I'm not as familiar with it. I've had a ton of success using Eleventy.js template files, but some folks prefer using a transform. And Eleventy config, again, our favorite little object there, has an add transform function as well. And with an add transform, you can create a function that writes a certain, what's what I'm looking for? It checks for certain type of file coming out of the compiler, Eleventy output, and can run certain types of file transforms on them. So some folks will actually have like JS uglification or minification running as a transform. And essentially a transform says, every time Eleventy makes a file, does it match a certain pattern? If so, manipulate its contents in this way. To me, using that to compile Sass or to tree shake, minify Java, tree shake or to handle imports of JavaScript seems a bit much. Compiling and transpiling seems heavy for a transform. But things like maybe you want to minify all of your HTML. Eleventy config.add transform and bring in HTML min from Node. And a quick note that I should not leave unsaid. I realize I didn't put it in the slide, but I want to say it out loud. Every time you're adding another Node module that does something for an Eleventy.js file, like processing images or roll up Babel, Sass, PostCSS plugins, all these things, make sure you npm I save them, npm install save them, so they end up in your package JSON. That way, if you run them through an automated build for deploys, they're always there. Those packages get installed and get used correctly. So I'm going to pause for a second. Last section. So if you have any other questions about asset pipelines and other ways to handle the non-markup side of the site, let me know. Otherwise, we are going to scoot into deploying. Hopefully going to wrap this up by 8 my time tonight, 8 Denver time, which is good. It's always better to finish early than late. And I'm working on getting better at that. So how do we deploy these things, these sites we've built? Well, the basicest option of all is our old friend FTP, or hopefully SFTP. You can build the site, and whatever ends up in the build folder _site, you copy that to your server. You just drop it up there with, Transmit or CodeKit or some other app with FTP built in. That's cool. That works. But in an enterprise, fancier context, we kind of want to automate things as much as we can. So how can we automate building and deploying our Eleventy sites? There's some great options, and I'm going to cover a few for you here. Netlify is by far my favorite. They are a dream to use. You hook up the repo to Netlify. It creates a build process. If it sees you've got Eleventy running, it automatically says, do you want your build command to be Eleventy? And it automatically pre-fills that for you. It is super handy. And it's got some other features I'm going to cover. They don't pay me to say this. It's just a great app. I love it. GitHub Pages is another great solution. You can have GitHub Pages with a GitHub action building and deploying your site every time you push to the main branch. And DigitalOcean just got in on the game with a new app platform they launched a few weeks ago. Static or single page apps on command as you push to, again, your main branch. They'll build and host those for you too. How do you get this built? Because I want to make something clear, which is we don't want to have to build and then commit our entire output directory in Git and then push that. You could, but that creates a lot of unnecessary merge conflicts. And if you're working on a team of other developers, they're just kind of wasted unnecessary merge conflicts because all you have to do to fix them is rerun the build command and push that. But it's a silly reason to have a merge conflict. So we don't need to do that. We can have it built for us automatically. So let's check out how to do that. Netlify automatically builds it. GitHub Pages, you'll need to add a GitHub action, and I've got a link here to the one I use for, I think it's this actual site you're looking at tonight, this slide deck, built and deployed for GitHub Pages with a GitHub action. Should mention also for GitHub action, you will need to create a private and public key pair and put those into your deploy keys and your repost secrets to get that to work. And there's some awesome tutorials. If you Google for a second, they'll pop right up on how to get that set up. And DigitalOcean's app platform automates that. Oh, I should also mention Vercel. Vercel is a very similar product to Netlify, automated cloud deploys that run static site generators. They're really big on Gatsby and Next, so that's their kind of bread and butter and where they market hard, but they will do any other node-based kind of a build process. So you can deploy Eleventy built sites there too. Some more advanced topics, because again, I promised a handful of enterprise-grade topics, a few of them, getting data from an API, automated building and deploying. What else is important? Form submission, yeah. A huge use case for static sites is marketing sites. And everybody always needs a form on there, right? So you could use a form service like Smart Forms or FormSpree or a handful of others. Woohoo or Woofoo, I think, was a big one for a while. There's a bunch of them. There's like a half a dozen or a dozen, probably more every month. And what you do is you put their URL in the action on your HTML form, and then it submits there. And a lot of them have a syntax for you to pass in a redirect value as well for where to send the user after the form is successfully submitted. Netlify will let you do that, no worries at all. But they have a magical thing too. If you do a Netlify attribute on any form, then Netlify automatically grabs that form, handles its submission, and saves results and can send you emails. Pretty cool stuff. So that's how you can handle things like form submission. A common use case that's normally pretty challenging to try and wire up on your own in a static site, but you can let somebody else handle it for you if that's a good pattern. Some of us are coming in from Vue or React or Angular, or Ember, etc. kind of experience, and we would like to transition between our pages in a smooth, nice, chill kind of way. That's a nice, fun user feature, and done tastefully can really set a page apart with a level of kind of cool professionalism. How do you do that? Well, the answer is the same way you would do that with any other non-single page app site. So this is how you would do this in WordPress or Drupal or like a server rendered page. This is how you would do it if you were generating a site with Nuxt or Jekyll or anything like that. You can add a JS transition library. Barba.js and Swap.js are two pretty good, well-featured ones. There's another one called Smooth State. It's a little older and it is jQuery dependent. So if you don't want to install jQuery on your site just for the sake of the page transition library, then use Barba or Swap, the one that doesn't require jQuery. Worth noting as well at this point that, nope, lost it. I was going to note something else, but my brain dropped the note. Anyway, these are cool ways to get your pages to transition in between routes. Of course, if you're doing that, hopefully these libraries have built-in accessibility features to focus the right place on route change, since it's not doing a full page reload always watch out for the accessibility side effects, especially with fancy animation related upgrades. Which brings me to the end. I'll point out some resources. These links all go to eleventy.dev, which is the documentation site. Their docs are well written and easy to follow. Provides code samples in lots of different templating languages, really handy. They also have a link there of many starter projects. So you can go and click the copy this repo button on GitHub for a lot of starter projects that different developers have made with different Eleventy use cases in mind. Some that use Gulp and some that use Parcel and some that have different ways to handle different features and some that hook up to Google Sheets API and some that hook up to Airtable for data, all sorts of different cool things. Really, really awesome and long list of starter projects for you to get the boilerplate out of the way and just start adding content. And then also Eleventy maintains a list of helpful posts, which are incredibly helpful. Different developers who have written blog posts on really useful Eleventy features or techniques. Again, just about anything you're working on solving, researching a problem, it's going to have something helpful there. Thanks so much for everybody who made it tonight. Thanks so much to everybody who's watching this later. I hope it's informative and informational, helpful for you all. I'm James Steinbach. I'm a senior UX developer. I like talking about this stuff, so if you want to hit me up with follow-up questions, by all means, you can find me at JD Steinbach on Twitter and GitHub and .com. And yeah, if you have more questions, comments, I would love to field some of those even after I wait another minute and the talk winds down. So if no other questions come in, thanks so much. I'm assuming you've all been a great audience. I can't see anybody staring at a camera, but it's great to have people in here, and thanks for the comments and the attention tonight. Hope you're having a great week, and hopefully there is rest and peace for everyone. So that would be great. We are grateful here at Front Range Front End to have you all coming. And yeah, thanks so much for tuning in. Hopefully this helps make some development processes easier or cooler or more performant and secure for you all. Thanks much and have a great night. Oh, before I turn the stream off, we did get a question. Awesome. Any Eleventy plugins that you found extra useful? That's a good question. Eleventy has a plugin system, and like a dummy, I didn't even add a slide for there are plugins. Yeah, there are some great ones. There's a navigation plugin. I described my menu order key in Front Matter for doing navigation, but there's a way richer Eleventy navigation plugin that's super handy. You can create nested navigation and all sorts of stuff. It just insists that you use the right Front Matter keys in the post that you want to be part of top or sub-level navigations. I've published a couple. One that I really highly recommend is a table of contents generator. If your Markdown compiler, which requires a little bit of an upgrade to Eleventy, if your Markdown compiler is set up to add IDs to every heading in your post content, then this will provide a filter that writes a table of contents based on nested lists matching your hierarchy of heading levels. That's a cool one too. I've written another one that does a drop cap in a really accessible way, so it wraps the markup correctly so that you can use a drop cap with a span rather than relying on the first letter CSS selector that's not super well supported yet. There's an inclusive language one that's commonly recommended by the core team that's really helpful in terms of helping you avoid words like, oh, just do this and simply, and some of the things we do that unfortunately can exclude especially newer or underrepresented or fresh members of the community and readers to your content. But yeah, I think there are 3 or 4 official Eleventy plugins, syntax highlighter, RSS feed generator. But yeah, you can find those linked, the official ones on eleventy.dev, and they're all pretty useful. And then I've written a couple that I think are pretty fancy too. There are others that do things like typeset.js, wrap some extra classes around fancy punctuation mark kind of things. Yeah, there's a whole bunch. It's a cool user kind of thing. And if you search for Eleventy plugin on NPM, you'll get even more. So yeah, thanks so much everybody who jumped in. And yeah, if you'll go out and write Eleventy sites, that'd be super cool. They're fast, they're performant, they're no JavaScript bundles and no hackable databases. It's a ton of great features. And Eleventy is a great tool to write static sites with. So for the second time, thanks so much for tuning in.